Sophia sat on the nearly empty subway car, her bag clutched tightly on her lap. She glanced at her phone. 11:59 p.m. She sighed. It was the last train of the night, delayed for nearly 20 minutes, and the air in the car felt heavy, stagnant, as though it hadn't been ventilated in years. As the train rumbled into a tunnel, the lights flickered briefly. When they stabilized, Sophia noticed something odd. Every other passenger was gone. The car was completely empty. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned her head quickly, peering through the glass doors to the adjoining cars, but they were dark. There was no sign of life anywhere. She had been surrounded by a dozen people just minutes ago. The train screeched along the tracks, and the faint tap-tap-tap of something against the window broke the silence. Sophia turned toward the sound, her stomach churning. The tapping grew louder, sharper. Suddenly, a face appeared in the window, pressed against the glass. Its pale skin stretched unnaturally tight, and its eyes were deep, black voids. A wide, too long smile split its face. The train was moving at full speed, and yet the face stayed in place, staring directly at her. Sophia screamed and scrambled to the other side of the car, her breath hitching as the tapping followed her. The face seemed to glide along the glass, its empty eyes unblinking. Then, without warning, the train screeched to an abrupt halt, throwing her forward. The lights went out, plunging everything into darkness. 11:59 p.m. Sophia jolted awake in her seat. Her bag was still clutched tightly in her lap, her phone glowing faintly in her hand. The time on the screen read 11:59 p.m. She blinked, her pulse racing. Had she fallen asleep? The train rumbled into the tunnel again, the lights flickering. She looked around, expecting to see the other passengers, but the car was empty once more. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. A message appeared, written in bold, blocky text. "Do you remember yet?" Her stomach dropped. What she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. The message had no sender, no timestamp. It shouldn't have been possible. The train screeched along the tracks, and the tapping sound returned. Her head snapped toward the window, dread pooling in her chest. The face was back, grinning, its dark eyes fixed on her. But now, the smile was gone, replaced by a look of anger. The figure began pounding on the glass with both hands, its expression twisted with rage. Sophia backed away, gripping the handrail. "This isn't real," she muttered to herself, her voice shaking. "It's not real." The train screeched to a halt again, and the lights flickered violently. For a brief moment, the figure disappeared. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing through the darkened car. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. The footsteps stopped. The lights blinked back on, and the figure stood at the far end of the car, its face impossibly close to hers despite the distance. Its black eyes bore into her soul. "Remember," it hissed, its voice raspy and distorted. The train lurched forward, and the lights went out once more. 11:59 p.m. Sophia woke up again, her chest heaving. Her phone buzzed, and she stared at it in disbelief. 11:59 p.m. The car was empty again. The tunnel was approaching. She felt a surge of panic, her mind racing. This wasn't a nightmare. She was trapped in something far worse. Her phone buzzed with another message. "You can't run from the truth." "No," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "No, I don't understand. What truth?" As the train rumbled into the tunnel, the lights flickered again. This time they didn't stabilize. The car plunged into darkness, and the tapping on the window began once more. Sophia didn't dare turn to look. She squeezed her eyes shut, clutching her bag tightly. "It's not real," she muttered. "It's not real." The tapping stopped. A hand clamped down on her shoulder. Her eyes snapped open, and she turned to see the face inches from her own. It wasn't outside the window this time. It was in the car with her. Its black eyes bored into hers, and its twisted smile stretched impossibly wide. "You left us to die," it whispered. "The fire." Sophia gasped as the subway car vanished, replaced by a burning room. Flames licked at the walls, smoke choking the air. She stumbled back, coughing, her eyes watering as the heat seared her skin. She was in an office, a familiar one. Papers and desks were scattered everywhere, and a group of people huddled near a blocked exit, their faces twisted in fear and desperation. Sophia froze as the memories came flooding back. This was the fire she'd escaped. The fire where she'd left them all behind. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This can't be real. I didn't." "You ran," a voice hissed behind her. She spun around to see the figure standing in the flames, its black eyes reflecting the inferno. "You didn't warn them. You left them to burn." The huddled people turned to her, their faces melting away to reveal skulls, charred and blackened. They began to chant, their voices overlapping. "You left us. You left us. You left us." Sophia screamed, covering her ears. The flames surged toward her, and she fell to her knees as the fire consumed her. 11:59 p.m. Sophia woke up again, her body trembling. Her phone buzzed. The time read 11:59 p.m. She didn't need to look around. She knew the car was empty. She knew the face would appear again. She knew the truth now. She had worked late that night at the office, and when the fire broke out, she'd found the only clear exit. She hadn't warned anyone. She hadn't tried to save them. She'd run. Sophia sat frozen as the train entered the tunnel. The tapping began, but this time, she didn't scream. She didn't run. The face appeared in the window, its expression unreadable. "You can't run forever," it said, its voice low and cold. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean to." "Too late," the figure said, its smile returning. The train screeched to a halt, and the lights went out. Forever trapped. Sophia woke up again. 11:59 p.m. The car was empty. The tunnel was ahead. The face would return. The flames would come. This time she didn't cry. She simply sat there waiting as the loop continued. Over and over, she would relive her guilt, her cowardice, her selfishness. The train would never reach its destination, and neither would she. Ethan jolted awake to the sound of a grandfather clock chiming in the living room. The deep, resonant bong echoed through the house, shaking him from a restless sleep. He rubbed his eyes and glanced at his phone on the nightstand. 11:57 p.m. A cold sweat broke out on his skin. His grandfather clock had stopped working years ago. The pendulum hadn't moved in ages. Why was it chiming now? The unsettling sound continued. Bong, 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 growing louder with each strike. Ethan slid out of bed, his heart pounding. He opened the door to the hallway, the faint scent of smoke hitting his nose. The house was dark, except for the flickering glow coming from the living room. As he moved closer, he noticed the shadows on the walls weren't just shifting, they were dancing, as though alive. When he entered the living room, the grandfather clock stood tall, its hands frozen at 12. The pendulum swayed slowly, and as it did, the walls seemed to shimmer like heat rising off pavement. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence, a faint laugh. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to freeze Ethan in place. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. No answer. He stepped closer to the clock. The closer he got, the stronger the smell of smoke became. He leaned in, touching the face of the clock, and the world tilted. 12 a.m. Ethan woke up in bed, gasping for air. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, and he grabbed it with shaking hands. 11:57 p.m. He stared at the screen, his mind racing. He could have sworn he'd just been awake, standing in front of the clock. The chiming began again, slow, deliberate, the sound reverberating through his chest. Bong. 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 Ethan's breath hitched as he heard the faint laugh once more. This time it was louder, closer. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and ran to the living room. The clock stood exactly as before, its hands frozen at 12, its pendulum swaying. But now, there were footprints in the dust on the floor, footprints that led from the clock to the center of the room, then vanished. He turned around, and the room blurred. When his vision cleared, he wasn't in his living room anymore. Ethan stood in a strange room, unfamiliar and suffocating. The walls were charred black, the ceiling dripping with some sort of dark liquid. A single chair sat in the middle of the room, facing him. On the chair was a framed photo. He approached cautiously, picking up the frame. It was a photo of him, sitting at the dining table with a woman and a little boy. The woman smiled warmly at the camera, but Ethan didn't recognize her. He didn't have a wife or a son. The moment he touched the frame, whispers erupted from the walls, low and guttural, words he couldn't understand. His head throbbed and the photo burst into flames in his hands. He dropped it, stumbling back, and suddenly he was back in his living room. 12 a.m. Dalla today. Ethan woke up again, drenched in sweat. 11:57 p.m. His phone vibrated, showing a new message. Remember what you did. What the hell, Ethan whispered, his voice cracking. His hands trembled as he stared at the message. He didn't recognize the number. He threw on his clothes and ran to the living room, desperate to understand what was happening. The clock was still there, its pendulum swaying, its hands frozen at 12, but this time, there was something new, a faint trail of soot leading to the front door. He followed it, flinging the door open. Instead of the quiet suburban street, he was greeted by an endless stretch of forest. The trees were tall and gnarled, their branches like skeletal hands reaching for him. A path stretched ahead, lined with burnt leaves. Ethan, the voice came from somewhere deep in the forest. It was faint but unmistakable. A child's voice. He hesitated, but the voice called again. Ethan. Help me. His heart wrenched at the sound, and before he could think, his legs carried him into the woods. The farther he went, the darker it became, the trees seeming to close in around him. The smell of smoke grew stronger. He tripped over something and landed hard on the ground. When he looked up, he saw a small cabin, engulfed in flames. 12 a.m. Ethan woke up screaming. 11:57 p.m. The message appeared on his phone again. Remember what you did. No, 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 he yelled, throwing the phone across the room. He grabbed a chair and smashed it against the grandfather clock, shattering the glass. But as soon as the pendulum stopped moving, the world around him blurred and twisted. He found himself standing in front of the burning cabin again, the heat licking at his skin. This time he heard the cries of a child from inside. Help, Daddy, help me. The word daddy hit him like a punch to the gut. He ran toward the cabin, but the flames were too intense. He tried to shield his face, but the fire pushed him back. I can't, he shouted, tears streaming down his face. The whispers came back, louder now, their words clearer. You left them. You left them to burn. No, that's not true, Ethan screamed. But deep down, he felt the truth settle over him like a weight. Memories flooded his mind, images of him storming out of the cabin, drunk and furious, his wife's pleas for him to stay, the smell of gasoline, the flick of a lighter. He'd left them. He'd left his wife and son in the cabin. The fire was his doing. 12 a.m. Ethan woke up, gasping for air. 11:57 p.m. the clock chimed, louder than ever before. His phone buzzed with a new message. It's time to pay. This time he didn't move. He didn't go to the living room or the forest or the burning cabin. He stayed in bed, clutching his head, trying to block out the whispers, the laughter, the cries. But the clock wouldn't let him rest. The chimes grew deafening, and the walls of his bedroom began to warp, melting into shadows and flame. The photo of the woman and boy appeared on his nightstand, their smiles now twisted into agonized screams. Ethan sobbed as the whispers turned into a single voice, his own. It said, "You can't escape what you did. You'll relive it forever." The fire consumed him, swallowing him whole. 12 a.m. Ethan woke up. The clock chimed. His phone buzzed. 11:57 p.m. And the nightmare began again. The rain pattered against the window as Emily stirred awake, her phone vibrating violently on the nightstand. She groggily grabbed it and squinted at the screen. It was 11:57 p.m. and a message from her best friend, Mia, flashed. "Have you checked your basement?" Emily sat up, her pulse quickening. Her first instinct was to call Mia, but when she tried, the call went straight to voicemail. "What kind of joke is this?" she muttered, staring at the message. The basement door was at the far end of the hallway, always shut, always locked. She hadn't been down there in months. The phone buzzed again. This time, a video. Her breath hitched as she clicked on it. The footage was shaky and dimly lit, but it was unmistakably her basement. The camera moved closer to a corner where an old trunk sat. The trunk's lid creaked open, revealing a mass of tangled black hair inside. Emily gasped and dropped the phone. It clattered to the floor. She glanced toward the hallway. The basement door stood ajar. Her throat went dry. She was sure she'd locked it before going to bed. Trembling, she grabbed a flashlight from her bedside drawer and stepped into the hallway. "Mia, if this is some kind of prank, it's not funny," she called out. Her voice echoed faintly. She hesitated at the top of the stairs, staring into the darkness below. The air felt heavy, thick, with an unexplainable sense of dread. Slowly, she descended the creaking stairs. Her flashlight beam danced across the walls, illuminating cobwebs and dust-covered shelves. She stopped at the trunk, her breathing shallow. The lid was closed. 12 a.m. Emily awoke with a start, drenched in sweat. Her heart hammered in her chest as she grabbed her phone. It was 11:57 p.m., and the same message from Mia flashed across her screen. "Have you checked your basement?" "No," she whispered, shaking her head. This isn't real, but when she tried calling Mia again, the phone went to voicemail just like before. The rain outside sounded identical. The faint creak of the basement door echoed down the hallway. Emily felt a creeping panic as she stood and made her way to the hallway. Once again, the door was open, the darkness beyond it inviting yet threatening. She retraced her steps, flashlight in hand, descending into the basement. The trunk was open this time. Inside, a cracked mirror reflected her pale face. Her reflection seemed distorted, her features stretched and hollow. She reached out to touch the mirror, and the surface rippled like water. Suddenly, a hand shot out from the mirror, its bony fingers grasping at her wrist. Emily screamed and stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. The basement plunged into darkness. 12 a.m. Her eyes snapped open. Rain. Phone vibrating. Have you checked your basement? Emily sat frozen in bed. It wasn't a dream. It was real. Every detail repeated itself: the time, the message, the sound of the rain. She didn't even bother calling Mia this time. She already knew the voicemail would answer. Instead, she ran to her front door. Locked. Deadbolt secured. She tried the windows. No luck, they were sealed shut. She even tried screaming for help, but her voice seemed swallowed by the house itself, absorbed into its suffocating silence. Think, Emily. Think, she whispered to herself. She grabbed a kitchen knife and approached the basement door, determined to end this nightmare. The stairs groaned under her weight as she descended. The trunk stood there, lid closed. This time she didn't wait. She flung it open. Inside was the same cracked mirror, but now it showed more than her face. It showed her standing in a room filled with blood. Her eyes in the reflection were wide and wild, her hands stained red. Behind her, a figure loomed, its face obscured. The reflection smirked. Emily recoiled, slamming the trunk shut. But when she turned around, the basement was no longer her basement. The walls were slick with a dark, sticky substance, and the air reeked of decay. A faint whisper filled the space, growing louder, echoing words she couldn't understand. And then, she saw them, shadows moving just beyond the edge of her vision. They circled her like predators, whispering her name. She screamed, backing into the trunk, her mind racing for an escape. The shadows closed in, their whispers turning into guttural growls. 12 a.m. a.m. Emily gasped awake, clutching her chest. She stared at her phone. 11:57 p.m. The message came through on cue. Have you checked your basement? No. Not again. Not again, she muttered, tears streaming down her face. This time she didn't move. She stayed in bed, gripping the knife she'd brought with her. The basement door creaked open as though taunting her. The whispers started again, faint at first but steadily growing louder. They came from everywhere behind her, under the bed, inside the walls. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, heavy and deliberate. Her bedroom door creaked open, and she squeezed her eyes shut, holding her breath. When she opened them, the room was empty. But on the wall, scrawled in what looked like blood, were the words, "You can't hide from yourself." Emily screamed and bolted out of the room. She ran toward the basement, figuring that facing the horror head-on was better than waiting for it to find her. She threw open the trunk, hoping to break the mirror or destroy whatever was causing the loop. But inside the trunk wasn't the mirror. It was a pile of photographs. They were of her, standing in the blood-filled room, holding a knife, smiling. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the cold floor, shaking uncontrollably. Her mind raced as she tried to piece it together. The shadows, the whispers, the images. What did they mean? What had she done? 12 a.m. Emily woke up. Her mind felt frayed, unraveling with each repetition. The message came again. The rain sounded again. The door creaked open again. She didn't bother with the knife or the flashlight this time. She simply walked down the hallway, down the stairs, and straight to the trunk, as though she were on autopilot. The mirror greeted her again, but this time, it didn't reflect her basement. It reflected a memory she'd buried deep. She saw herself years ago, standing in the same basement. Mia was with her, crying, begging for her life. Emily was holding a knife, her face blank, emotionless. The blade came down. Once. Twice. Again and again, until the crying stopped. No, Emily whispered, stumbling back. That's not true. That's not real. The mirror rippled, and her reflection stepped out of it. It wasn't distorted anymore, it was her, but colder, darker. The reflection smiled. "You buried her in the basement," it said, its voice low and mocking. "You locked away the truth. But you can't lock away guilt." Emily backed away, shaking her head. "You're lying." The reflection lunged at her, its hands like claws. Emily screamed as it grabbed her, dragging her toward the mirror. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, chanting her name, her sins, her lies. 12 a.m. Emily woke up. Rain pattered against the window. Her phone vibrated. 11:57 p.m. The message from Mia flashed. "Have you checked your basement?" This time she didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply stared at the message, numb. She knew now that there was no escape. She would descend those stairs, open that trunk, and face the truth again and again and again. Because the loop wasn't about punishment. It was about remembering. And remembering was the worst torture of all. If you like the video, please like, subscribe, and share the video with others. See you in the next video.